Welcome back, everybody, and welcome along to a very exciting edition of Decline and Fall, where we answer your questions, and we'll be getting to those in just a while. Crucial questions such as, how many prime ministers does it take to run the United Kingdom? Answer: about as many as the last prime minister. Loved the about as much as the last prime minister loved the services of Ukrainian Zoolanders. Is the appropriate answer to that question. Brackets allegedly, brackets pending super injunction, brackets don't sue. But we will be getting to a variety of very interesting questions that have come in on Substack. And joining me as always from the once and future Socialist Yugoslavia, it's Kit Clarenberg. Kit, how does the day find you?
Very well, very well. And it's great to see so many people have joined from every corner of the globe, live. That's fantastic to see, and we're also thrilled that there was a significant interest in us doing this Q&A. And after we've dealt with a bit of contemporary business, we're going to dive right into your questions. So yeah, it should be a good one, if I do say so myself.
Well, we've already got a good audience coming in from right off the bat, with only a minute gone. So thank you to everybody who's tuned in. We have got people from the United States, from Wales, from Somerset, from Bristol, from Hong Kong, Sweden, North Africa, and Prague. We've got the south coast of old perfidious Albion. And we got the Southwest as well represented. So a good geographical coverage. In fact, all four corners of the globe. Oh, and we also have Svetlana in Moscow. Good to have you with us. So as Kit indicates, what we're going to do is get into a couple of contemporary things. Then we will dive headlong into your questions, like a disgraced former prince diving into all the opportunities presented to him on Epstein's Island. Perhaps more of him later. We now go though to on the docket this week, which is that there appears to be another iteration of a peace plan that the White House has come up with for Ukraine. This one seems, according to the latest reporting, to be something which has been redeveloped out of the Kellogg plan, so that it actually does do some of what the Russians asked for, which is recognizing at least the current combat line as a Russian line of control in Zaporozhye and Kherson, and apparently will demand Ukraine withdraw from the rest of Donbass, which isn't much, really, considering the advances that the Russians have been making recently. But so far, it looks as if the Europeans, and or at least publicly, and certainly the Zelensky regime, have publicly rejected this. But the Zelensky regime itself is now absolutely mired in crisis, given that Zelensky is accused of being a part of a circle of corruption. Well, who's fucking surprised about that, to be honest? And is being investigated by the corrupt anti-corruption agencies in the Ukrainian government, which mysteriously enough appear to have a direct FBI liaison running them now. So, Kit, I'll throw to you two-part question. Is this the end of the show for Kiev's most famous actor? And also, what chance do you give this latest peace proposal between a burnt-out former prime minister's car and, shall we say, a super injunction's chance of succeeding? Go ahead.
Well, I mean, to take your questions in reverse order, number two, on whether this is going to be implemented, I think it's very unlikely. And this is despite the US seemingly pushing full steam ahead with the plan, threatening to completely cessate any and all financial, military, and intelligence assistance for Kiev if they don't sign up by next week. But if you actually go through the terms, and yes, that we've kind of gone here before. Number one, it's quite remarkable that Russia is willing to make, at least theoretically, is willing to make some significant concessions in terms of allowing 100 billion of its seized assets to be loaned to Ukraine. what's the word? A stop on seizing further territory beyond the four oblasts which rejoined Russia back in 2022. So, I mean, that's quite significant. And also, yes, Ukraine will be open to EU membership, although, I mean, how feasible and plausible that is a different question. But also, it looks the interesting aspects of this kind of look ahead to US and Russia cooperation in economic terms, an end of sanctions on Russia, and significant limits on if not outright prohibitions on foreign missile systems, foreign soldiers being deployed to Ukrainian territory, how big Ukraine's military can be, and how many tanks and other weaponry and vehicles it can maintain at any one time. So from Ukraine's perspective, it's a bad deal, but it's the best that they can possibly get at this stage. And I might add as well that one of the reasons that they almost inevitably that Kiev is going to reject this is that it stipulates that elections must be held in Ukraine within 100 days. So Zelensky is going to just say no to that right off the bat. If you look at opinion polling, his popularity is in the absolute toilet, and this is despite a total control of the media, the ability to ban political parties for no good reason, and an environment in which even the most minor dissent is crushed and people end up in jail or even assassinated by Zelensky's henchmen. So I don't think there's any chance of this going ahead. However, on the one hand, it is very interesting and perhaps encouraging that the US is facing up to the reality that this is just a completely lost enterprise. This is over now, it's done. But B, as well, in the spirit of these things, if Zelensky doesn't accept these terms, and I think there's an almost 100% chance that he won't, then, well, I mean, we're going to fast forward to maybe a year from now where the terms are you get to keep Kiev, and that's about it. The Russians are advancing everywhere. They are seizing vast amounts of prisoners of war. They're decimating the Ukrainian positions all along the front line in south and eastern Ukraine. The dam is ready to burst at any given moment. They're in no hurry. They have no. Moscow has no particular reason to stop at the line of contact, as it were. They can just keep going. From Ukraine's perspective, a very bad deal, but this is kind of like last chance saloon for them for the country to still exist in anything like its current form. But yeah, it is something that is almost undoubtedly not going to be accepted by Zelensky, and it will likely be sabotaged by the British. Our dear friend and repeat show favourite Kaja Kallas has said that that this is a betrayal of Ukraine and that the EU won't accept it. Already the signs that this is just going to falter are there.
Well, I think that this is, again, a case of the Trump administration essentially like whistling in the dark, because there was a conversation had between Kirill Dmitriev, the head of the Russian Sovereign Wealth Fund, and now quite what his official position he holds on this, I'm not sure, given that he represents the, as far as I'm aware, like the remnants of like the Russian liberals who still labor under the delusion that they can restore economic ties with the West, particularly Russia-American economic ties. And it was done between him, Steve Witkoff, Trump's old real estate business, and Jared Kushner. Now, none of those people on the American side hold official positions, nor does Dmitriev, other than his position as head of the Russian Sovereign Wealth Fund. So quite what they're in a position to agree is an interesting question. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian government has already rejected this. It was rejected by their UN ambassador yesterday in the usual way. Callas has rejected it. The British Foreign Office has said their usual statement about if Putin wants to stop the war, he can do it tomorrow, etc. So, and also Mike Waltz, the Trump's UN ambassador himself, basically stated a sort of reworded version of what Callas said, but in an American accent. So the position in the Trump administration itself is still unclear. So I think that this is them like wish casting almost, like that if they could just get this through, because all Zelensky needs to do is to hold firm and reject this. His survival, I do think he will politically survive this latest corruption wave. His survival is based on the fact that he's really the only one left who can sort of have a remote chance of tying together all these different factions within the Ukrainian regime. Because you have the out and out fascists who hate him, but who sort of put up with him at the moment because they themselves couldn't come out and run Ukraine in the open by themselves. That would be too little plausible deniability for the West to stomach. Even if they got one of these right sector guys or Azov guys to maybe clean himself up a bit, put a suit on, and go to an LGBTQ plus event and say, "Hey, I don't mind you guys," whatever. It is unlikely that they could rule themselves. There's the opposition types like Tikhonovskaya and people like that who were around like 20 plus years ago and have been in office repeatedly, and who are also despised by the great majority of Ukrainians by now. There's people associated with the old Yushchenko presidency, again, despised and discredited figures. There's the ever-present sort of lingering horror that is Petro Poroshenko, again, a despised figure. And there are others in the military and the intelligence services like Budanov who might fancy a go at it. But Zelensky's the one who ties all this and the extravagant backing from the foreign powers together in a way that none of the others really do. So if they get rid of him, it's not just a case of getting rid of him. It's that then the very delicate balance between all these different factions in the Kiev regime comes unstuck. And you could end up with each of the factions deciding that the best way for them to gain power is via the gun. And then the Kiev regime just collapses in on itself in a near state of civil war, when the Russians then won't have to do very much. Because the thing about this Ukrainian army at the moment is it's getting absolutely fucking battered over and over again, having huge casualties inflicted upon it. And as soon as it looks as if there's going to be a break in that, as soon as it looks as if the controlling regime fractures in any way, if it falls apart completely even, then the men line are going to, there's a strong risk that what they'll do is just turn around and say, well, fuck this. And you'll see more massive surrenders, you'll see more desertions, you'll see more parts of the front line falling to pieces. So in terms of getting rid of Zelensky, I don't think that Zelensky's going to resign. Resigns, then what little protection he's got against assassination goes out the window. Even if they offer him a deal to transport him to his villa in Florida or London or wherever it is. And there's not a credible candidate as to who could replace him, because Zaluzny's not a credible candidate either. He's just another British puppet who happens to have 2 photos of Stepan Bandera in his wallet. So none of this really works. And also, the Trump administration seems again to be mainly talking to itself. Doesn't seem to have got the Ukrainians on board with this. The Europeans will not be on board with this. The British will try to sabotage it. And as a post by Armchair Warlord pointed out recently, as long as they can continue to pretend that the war in Ukraine can be won, because the casualties that are being inflicted are huge, but they're largely invisible to a Western audience. As long as they can keep pretending that that's the case, they can spin this war out for as long as there is a Ukrainian with at least one leg they can throw into this horrific meat grinder. But that's my overall take on this. Did you have anything else you wanted to add?
Well, no, I mean, I just think that, I think there are a lot of different conflicting in interests here, and from Zelensky's perspective, just hanging on to power is the key thing, and he'll do that at all costs, because and here we see on screen the areas of the front line where Russia is making significant advances, and all of these major cities are about to collapse. His sole concern is holding on to power and not getting murdered. And that's probably the same is true for a lot of his subordinates. I have previously outlined a theory, and it's just a theory, that one of the reasons that the Ukrainians are so doggedly holding on to these positions, despite the fact they're getting blitzed by drones, by smart bombs, by artillery, on a daily basis, is because Zelensky potentially wants to thin out the number of people who can be conscripted into this complete nightmare, so he can at some stage sign a peace deal, because hey, we haven't got any other options left. But then, by the same token, the far right forces standing behind him want to keep this going for as long as possible, and they've explicitly stated that there was a member of right sector who was involved in the Odessa massacre, who told the Times of London not long ago, if Zelensky cedes territory, then he's going to be dead, in very, very literally. So it's a very mixed picture, and it's difficult to unravel really what the objectives are here, from various different perspectives. I strongly suspect that the US want this over as quickly as possible, because they know it's going to be an embarrassing defeat, and irrespective of what form that takes. And if they can spin this narrative that, oh well, we were the peacemakers and we were the ones that ended this, at least that's some kind of propaganda victory, even if only in the heads of White House aides and idiots in the Pentagon. But as I say, Russia has zero incentive to make any compromises, yet apparently, according to this peace proposal, is willing to do so. Maybe this is intended from their perspective as an invitation to the Ukrainians to actually talk and be serious about the terrible situation they're in, but their audience it doesn't want to listen to them. So, I strongly suspect that this will be rejected. That Trump's threats of total ending of backing for Kiev might not actually materialize when it comes down to it. But equally, I mean, this isn't just an issue of the US no longer having the will or ability to provide Ukraine money and weapons, etc. There's also the inability of Europe to do so as well. For all of the rhetoric about how this is a terrible capitulation and Russia isn't seeing anything and they're the aggressor here, and we're determined to keep this going, to support Ukraine as long as possible. They don't actually have the ability to do that. So again, it's just this gigantic quagmire rhetoric not being matched by anything rooted in reality. There is we had a story recently which it gained some media prominence for a few days and then got promptly forgotten about. That Ukraine was signing a contract with France to buy 200 fighter jets to really bring the fight to Russia, and then in the small print, buried at the bottom of news articles on this, the jets aren't going to arrive until 2035. So it's like, right, well, when Ukraine no longer exists, they'll get these fighter jets, which they're buying with money they don't actually have. So there is I think perhaps deliberately as well, there is a hall of mirrors that's being created here. But as long as there, as you say, as long as there are people who can be fed into the meat grinder, Ukraine will probably try and keep this going rather than accept any negotiated settlement until the point is reached that they literally can't do anything else.
Yeah. Well, this is like a company drifting towards bankruptcy, with the directors coming up and with various different scams to boost the share price for a few days and a few weeks. So, like like announcing that the investors have put in like a new bunch of loans or something like that, or they've secured new capital from somewhere. Then you read the fine print and it says like this: in 10 years, in 20 years, spread over 50 years. And the only reason for this announcement, first of all, maybe to juice the share price of French aerospace companies, but also to give Zelensky political juice, because he can run around, or his representatives can run around Ukraine saying that, well, we've got 100 French-made jets on the way. We have an infinite amount of Tomahawk missiles in the post, maybe. We have the latest British tank coming when it's produced. And it's all to do the same thing. It's all just to bolster Zelensky, to make it look as if he's the guy who can bring home the backing from the big powers, and to keep him propped up for another few weeks, another few days, another few hours, even with a whole batch of positive news stories. And this will, as you say, this will keep going until there is literally nothing left of the Kiev regime, till their army has been destroyed, completely destroyed, or surrendered, until there's nothing more that can be thrown at the Russians, until the Russians have, in reality, will need to, as I've said before, take Kiev and visibly break and destroy the Kiev regime. And until they do that, then no one in the West is going to ever want to admit just how badly this is going. Because at the moment, this is a strange occurrence of like, this current wave of fighting suits both sides in a way. It suits the Europeans and elements in the United States because they can claim that everything's going great, or at least everything is still tolerable, because Russia is only advancing a tiny amount and is having huge casualties inflicted upon it. And these Ukrainians are very brave and just need to keep going. And it suits the Russians because the Europeans and the Americans keep feeding them the Ukrainian army on a plate to be devoured. So it is the cruelest war in that sense, in which is the Ukrainians themselves are being destroyed by the tactics employed by their own supposed backers. And that will continue to be the case because they just, there is no real care for Ukraine, any of its supposed allies. Now, the other thing to emphasize here is that the US keeps threatening or keeps saying that Ukraine must accept the peace terms, but in reality, the US hasn't done very much to actually make Ukraine accept the peace terms. And the risk from the US's perspective is, even if these peace terms were accepted by the current Ukrainian regime, even if Zelensky did accept them, even if they had elections in a few months, whatever is left of Ukraine after a peace deal is signed, is likely to be enormously unstable, incapable of actually generating much economic growth, will need hundreds and hundreds of billions to rebuild. and will be populated by mainly very angry, heavily armed fascist guys roving around with a grudge. So, in actual fact, why would the West really want to be responsible for that, do you think?
Yeah, well, exactly. And I mean, I think that we've discussed this before, but it does bear repeating. But like, one of the reasons, even though they would never phrase it in such a manner, that the European leaders want this kept going is because they don't want the blowback that's inevitable from this. And so you got to bear in mind that, like in July 2022. Europol was warning about the risk of returning Ukrainian uh, foreign fighters returning from Ukraine, radicalized and like battle hardened and bitter, and the proliferation of weapons skimmed off shipments to Ukraine in Europe's arms black markets. So I mean, that is a reason to keep this going. The fascists and neo Nazis who they've so eagerly embraced in the worthless cause of trying to break up Russia might turn on them. Czech intelligence not long ago announced that they didn't want Ukrainians with military service entering their country. And were willing to, try and lobby for legislation to prevent that from happening. So, yeah, I mean, it is a massive quagmire that the West has created for themselves by pouring all of their weapons into Ukraine, by galvanizing and encouraging, the most violent, dangerous, and deranged elements on the ground. That's from their perspective, another key, another, like core component of wanting to keep this going. But I mean, irrespective of how it ends, there are going to be those elements there unless somehow they are all killed. I somehow doubt it, particularly given that you have, say, like Centuria, which is a neo-Nazi fraternity, which is trying to radicalize young Ukrainian refugees across Europe. And this has been reported on by the German media. There are Centuria runs camps in the German countryside, weekend getaways for children where they're indoctrinated in nationalist ideology, and there is zero oversight, zero attempts seemingly by local security and intelligence services to do anything about this. So I mean that threat is always going to be there.
Mm. Yes, indeed, and the other point about this is that the promised or the hinted at European mobilization for war with the Russians at some point in the near future, most likely, as we've covered before, isn't going to materialize either. For all the morons in the French general staff and people like our show favorite Chris Donnelly like to talk about, there's absolutely no sign that these societies can be mobilized for war with the Russians. And also, there's no sign that they would ever have the capability of doing this. This is not 1857. You can't sail peacefully through the Mediterranean to the Black Sea, deposit a strike force, and charge Sevastopol again. This isn't going to happen. And we have expressed the opinion before, and it bears repeating, that most of these dire pronunciations about the need to militarize society are in actual fact principally targeted internally rather than externally. Now, speaking of internal enemies and unstable regimes, we would like to just conclude this bit of the show by talking a little bit about our beloved Prime Minister. Well, the beloved Prime Minister of perfidious Albion, a certain Sir Keir Starmer, friend to Jimmy Savile and the National Security Agency of the United States. He apparently is, I think the technical term from the character of Malcolm Tucker in the Thick of It show is he's fucked, like Caligula's favorite watermelon. Now, the fate of Keir Starmer is being discussed by numerous commentators here in Britain, and it looks like the Labour Party, under the shall we say the urging of certain forces within the British establishment, is getting ready to pull the plug on poor old Sir Keir. And after he'd been so loyal to them, after all, Clive Lewis, who I find to be an unbearable opportunist buffoon, but does represent a certain tendency on the sort of what I would call the soft left in the Labour Party, is offering to stand down in favour of Andy Burnham. Now, Andy Burnham is a former frontbencher in the Blair and Brown governments, a man who is a Labour Party right-winger who is clever enough to keep strong ties with the hierarchy of the trade unions in this country. So now you've got people in Unison, especially, which is the biggest public sector trade union, openly saying that Burnham should be leader. You've got that ghastly, shiny homunculus, Wesley Streeting, openly saying almost that he wants the job. You have even Lucy Powell, my former opponent, by the way, in a by-election and parliamentary election in the Manchester Central constituency in 2012 and 2015. By the way, I didn't win, but I did beat her in a debate once. She has said basically that the Labour Party internally is rotten, and the Parliamentary Labour Party is full of conspiracies and is vile to be in. So Keir is draining authority quicker than blackmail money gets drained out of a potentially blackmailed man's bank account and into the PayPal account of, so we say, some Ukrainian male models. But Kit, does all of this have a link to the previous story we were discussing? Are the British establishment ready to give Keir the heave ho in anticipation of a disaster in Ukraine?
Well, indeed, and I think that when it became clear that the ground was being readied for Starmer's removal, and we heard a lot about how Wes Streeting was going to connect with working class voters, which is just a completely ludicrous proposition. This kind of spitting image puppet of a man with zero principles, he just kind of just oozes this sleaze and unctuousness, and indeed it is also, like in the pocket of the private healthcare lobby while serving as health secretary. I did wonder whether the purpose was to get Keir out because of his all-in Ukraine stance. Burnham has been silent on foreign policy, but he's also been silent on every other form of policy, because I think that the purpose is as you suggested, it would just be a rebranding. Now, I think it's quite interesting that Clive Lewis, of all people, is openly offering Burnham. He's openly offering Burnham to step down so Burnham can run for his seat and then make a leadership run. Number one, this assumes that Burnham would actually win that election, which is questionable to a large extent. But also as well, Clive Lewis himself was under Corbyn being talked up as a potential replacement for Corbyn by people like Owen Jones, by other fake left underminers of the Corbyn project, to the extent that there was a conference in the City of London. I think it was in 2017. It was called Building a Progressive Coalition, and there were calls for Clive Lewis to lead a Labour Party, which was part of a broader party coalition, including the Greens, including the Lib Dems, and all of the kind of non-conservative parties in Parliament. So the fact that Clive Lewis is willing to do this it does suggest that he's no longer seen as a viable replacement or leader in waiting. And in the manner of these people, he knows that executive positions on boards of private sector companies in the worst industries imaginable await him if he steps down. This is Chuka Umunna, who the best part of 10 years ago was being talked up as Britain's Obama. He joined. He after attempting to sabotage Corbyn by setting up Change UK, he just slipped off quietly into consulting and serving on numerous financial industry boards, and has never been heard of again. And so, I mean, there is clearly a willingness by the Labour right wing to commit personal seppuku for the greater good. And the greater good from their perspective is preventing anything good from happening and neutralizing the left in the process. So, I mean, yeah, like I would imagine that, Burnham, in the manner of Starmer, when, he ran on a platform of purely I'm not the prime minister and we're not the government. That was their sales pitch to the public. I think that Burnham's sales pitch will be, well, I'm not Keir Starmer. And that'll be it. And I have a kind of non-posh accent, even if I went to the same schools and universities as Labour's elite did. So it would literally just be, putting yet further lipstick on an irrecoverably ugly pig. If this does come to pass, it could well be related to Starmer's all-in approach to Ukraine. Because I mean, as we've documented on the show at length, Starmer. And it's purely rhetorical. I mean, this is not backed by anything, but he has repeatedly made bold pronouncements about British backing for Ukraine and the necessity of strengthening Britain's defences in the face of Russian aggression and destabilization in Europe, etc. Perhaps with a new kind of placeholder in office, all of that can be kind of forgotten, and it's just like, oh well, that was the previous government, not us.
Well, yes, I think there is an element of that definitely in play here. There's also the fact that Starmer is about as popular as, shall we say, nettle rash on a ball sack, which is never something which anybody wants to experience. And the other point is that his government is chaotic and seemingly without purpose. The only thing, and also the Prime Minister himself, Starmer, is a sort of brittle robot of a man who is unable to talk except in like stilted and sort of ridiculous cliches. He sort of squawks every time he speaks as if he's been permanently surprised or in the depths of some kind of horrible sort of psychotic episode. So Burnham is a more convincing politician. He's a better performer in terms of his ability to at least seem, I emphasize that word, like a relatively normal human being, whereas Thomas just seems so bizarre, so odd. And just going around saying, I'm not Keir Starmer, would probably keep the show on the road for another year, roughly, depending upon if the economy totally collapses or not, which is really all that they're looking for. There's a big problem that the British ruling class have, which is that they can't quite agree what they want in terms of the way forward. There are those who favour using this current Labour government with its large majority to, as they would see it, undo the damage of the Tory years, particularly with regard to Brexit. There are those in the ruling class who look at this and think, well, if we could just undo Brexit and get back in the EU, that would address some of the problems. Now, I don't think it would. The problems in Britain are far too deep-seated to be addressed by simply rejoining an economic bloc. But that doesn't mean they're not going to try. And if they could get Burnham in place, he's a bit more of a convincing salesman than Starmer. They could pull off like some kind of rejoining the EU, but it wouldn't be called that. It would be called like a regulatory realignment or something. But it would be something that even if Farage got in, he would find very difficult to undo. So there are those who want that done. There are those then beyond that, including your old friends who you've reported on before, people like Gwyvain Prince and others, who favour a sort of rabid British sort of Javier Milei style government to create the much fabled Singapore on Thames. Another ridiculous idea that would not work, but they do exist, and those are sort of floating around the right wing of the Tories, and Reform. But Reform themselves, whilst they are ahead in the polls, are not popular. What's going on here is that none of the establishment parties have any credibility left. Reform are just benefiting from the fact that like there's enough people who would vote for them, and there's nobody left who would vote for the Labour Party or the Tories. So we have a full-blown economic and political disintegration in Britain, slowly unfolding before us. And bringing in a man with a vaguely Mancunian accent isn't going to change that. Just as bringing in Nigel Farage wouldn't change that either. In fact, if Farage would accelerate the problems, if anything. So, in all likelihood, Keir will be gone by the middle of next year, probably packed off to the House of Lords to slowly drink himself to death on the red benches. Long may he rot at the bottom of a bottle of port. We should now, I think, move urgently and with great precision into the uncharted territory of the question and answer section. And thank you to those of you who have submitted questions thus far. We have 6 questions coming in. We have 4 from Substack, and we have 2 from YouTube and X. Feel free to submit more. If we don't get to them today, we will return to this in a month's time for another one of these, I'm sure. So, Kit, I will throw the first one to you. And this is from username Dialdanan Vanisdea on Substack. Question number 1 is, was Stalin the monster he was made out to be? Nice, easy one for you for the start.
Okay, well, absolutely not. And I think it's important to bear in mind that as a starting point, that an enormous amount of mainstream. I mean, if you do like Google searches for like for books on the Soviet Union, and we'll get into this further in due course. They're all absolutely terrible anti-communist screeds written by right-wing lunatics, which rely on the same propaganda, completely false propaganda sources, I might add, to paint a picture of the Soviet Union, not only under Stalin, but just in general, as being an unmitigated hell on earth, in which people forcibly lived under misery. This is complete and utter bollocks, and it's quite funny that like if you can find CIA files, and we will add it to the show notes, I think, when we publish this on Substack, you can find CIA files where CIA operatives themselves talk about the level of public ignorance of how the Soviet Union actually operates. And why is there widespread public ignorance of how the Soviet Union operates? Oh, it's because of the bullshit that you yourselves spew on a daily basis. So, a very prominent anti-communist historian was Robert Conquest. There was this kind of British-American writer, and he was regarded as one of the world's leading Sovietologists during the Cold War. His books on which were heavily anti-Stalin, about the supposed Great Terror and the famines that occurred in the incipient era of the Soviet Union. They're heavily informed, if not completely informed, by black propaganda produced by Information Research Department, which was Britain's Cold War era fake news factory. So it's all lies. And yeah, like such was the level of the lies involved that the CIA themselves were kind of found it frustrating that people were so ignorant of how the Soviet Union actually operated. Now, number one, a key source of the notion that Stalin was this megalomaniacal lunatic and also a terrible wartime leader and just this kind of stupid peasant is not only the writings of Trotsky and his adherents, and Trotsky was extremely bitter that Stalin became leader when Trotsky didn't. It must be stressed that Stalin didn't actually want to become leader and repeatedly threatened to quit at various points and was very serious about that. He also rejected receiving the title of the hero of the Soviet Union repeatedly because of his stewardship of the country during World War II, or the Great War as it's known in Russia. And so in effect, actually, the key source of a lot of the anti-Stalin sentiment is not only Anglo-American intelligence black propaganda. It's also the speech that Khrushchev gave in February 1956, where he denounced Stalin and the quote-unquote cult of personality that had arisen around Stalin. He portrayed Koba, as he was nicknamed, this kind of mad, bloodthirsty dictator who was, pathologically vain, etc. Number one, it must be stressed that that speech was given secretly, but serendipitously leaked out to the world via Soviet emigres who defected to the CIA, and James Angleton, the CIA's counterintelligence chief, in closed-door testimony to the Senate in 1975, which was recently released in the JFK document dump. He talks about how we used that speech to its full extent, and it triggered attempted revolution in Poland in June that year, and also the Hungarian uprising, I believe it was in November 1956. So, that the political utility of what Khrushchev said from the West perspective was significant, and we must ask ourselves whether that was deliberate. Probably the best kind of single resource on the reality of who Stalin was and what the Soviet Union was like under his rule is provided by Domenico Lacerdo, and he wrote this book called Black Stalin a few years ago, which is well worth poring over. It's like a kind of synthesis of material from a variety of sources, including people who were vicious detractors of Stalin, and he pretty comprehensively and very persuasively demonstrates that there is this completely false vision of who Stalin was and what his rule entailed. And moreover, drawing on Trotsky as sources, I might add, he demonstrates that, the supposed Great Terror with all of its purges, it was genuinely concerned with trying to neutralize and counter-revolutionary forces within the Soviet Union. Now, it must also be stressed that Trotsky, who's in some people's eyes the acceptable face of communism, in 1939. He was talking about removing Ukraine from the quote-unquote Soviet yoke, which, this is at a time when you have the Nazis infiltrating Ukraine and building up ultra-nationalist networks in the country who would later become complicit in the Holocaust. Ukraine was also viewed by the British and the Americans as a potential beachhead for invasion of the Soviet Union and its breakup into constituent, easily exploitable chunks. So, a vast propaganda matrix has been constructed around Stalin, which is very difficult to break through because you have the same, you have a kind of constellation of supposedly independent sources who all rely on the same bullshit to draw the same conclusions.
Yes, and I've just posted one of the articles, the offending articles by Trotsky, in the chat, so you can all have a look at it. This one is entitled "The Problem of the U Calls for a Free Independent Soviet Ukraine." Now, in the matter of all these things, one should analyze not just what someone says, but in the full context of where and when someone says it. There was about as much chance of a free, independent Soviet Ukraine in 1939, given the balance of forces as they stood, as there was of, shall we say, an independent socialist republic breaking out in the middle of, shall we say, Chelsea in London at the time, and surviving for 5 years under the onslaught of the British ruling class. Fact is, had there been a anti-Soviet uprising in Ukraine at the time, that would have been not powered by the fantasy revolution that the Trotskyites claim they believe in, but by fascists. That's who would have benefited from Ukraine being ripped out of the Soviet Union, and that's who would have come to power. And as to who then benefited from that more widely, well, that would have been German imperialism, which, much like in 1914, had its eyes on Ukraine as a potential agricultural territory, just as now the agribusiness companies are the ones who've been buying up all the land in Ukraine. Times change, priorities and profitable assets don't. In some cases, anyway. Well, but to the question of Stalin himself, I mean, Kit's already covered the propaganda angle. So I won't repeat that, but I will say that, like, the demonization of Stalin needs to be addressed by those of us who consider ourselves to be communists in the imperial core nations, because the demonization of Stalin didn't actually impact anything like as much in places like India, in places like China. And by the way, to this day, even after years of market reforms in China, still hold Stalin in a high degree of esteem. Even during all the Deng Xiaoping period, this didn't change, which is rather interesting to note. It didn't happen. It didn't get demonized in Vietnam or any of the other nations that were going through anti-colonial revolutions inspired by the work of the Soviet Union. It happened in the West, and it happened in the West because there was a need that the ruling class had to make sure that the working class were turned away from the path of revolution. And part of that was a process of reform, and part of that was a process of demonization of the Soviet Union and making sure that people got repelled away from it. And the demonization of Stalin was crucial to that. Now, I could get into why Khrushchev made that ridiculous speech that was filled with lies, but that would mean that we would be here for about 5 hours. I will urge you all to read the works of Grover Furr, who's an academic whose actual speciality is medieval history, but who applied like an academic's lens to the anti-Stalin paradigm. And what he finds, because he's gone over the Khrushchev speech and checked all the sources that Khrushchev used and found that most of it is lies or wild exaggerations. He's gone over the works of like Timothy Snyder and people like that, and again found that the sources that they use, as Kit said, are basically just fascists from the 1930s, information research department hacks of the 1940s and 50s, and then other people quoting them, and then other people quoting them. The anti-Stalin paradigm in academia depends basically on no one ever following up on the sources and no one ever questioning the sources. Now, if you were presenting, shall we say, a physics paper or a paper on biology, if you made a load of spurious claims that are basically based on hearsay and repetition of pure fictions from 80, 90 years ago, you wouldn't be able to get away with that. But because this is the study of history in the West is not based on actual history, which are not done in a scientific way. It's just propaganda, especially when it comes to recent history and the history of socialism. You can get away with writing anything. You could write that Stalin dined on a raw human livers for breakfast, and if you said it in a way that was convincing enough, and you had a posh enough English accent, you could probably pull that off and get a book tour of the United States out of it as well. Incidentally, Robert Conquest was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom by George W. Bush. Leave you to all to draw your own conclusions about what kind of a life he led. But on the virtues of Stalin, I would say just two things. First of all, Stalin as a Marxist theoretician is severely underrated. His work on both theoretical problems, I mean, most of what we come to regard as Leninism was put together by Stalin, drawing from the work of Lenin. In the book entitled Foundations of Leninism, I'll just grab my copy of it from the nearby bookshelf. So yes, that's the old Beijing print from the 60s there. His work on the national question is one of the most comprehensive treatments of the national question ever done. He was responsible for writing the Soviet nationality policy, the first one, and developing it. And even after he'd been denounced by the Khrushchev clique, the Soviet nationality policy, as he had written it, largely remained in place. And in fact, it forms the basis for the Russian nationality policy now. For all that Putin talks this gibberish about, the Russian way to respect local languages, religions, and cultures. It wasn't under the Tsar. I think that's fairly uncontroversial to say outside of United Russia circles. No, the policy that the Russian government has, at least on paper, how well enforced this is, I don't know because I don't live in Russia. But the respect and the promotion of local minority languages, the respect for, and the promotion and protection of minority religions, the emphasis on a united country that is bound together, not against it. It's not being divided by its differences, but the differences being overcome by a shared identity. That's not the Tsardom. That's the Stalin period, and the fact that that this survives to this day shows how potent a piece of legislation and political practice this actually was, and how badly the revisionists that followed Khrushchev had to either sabotage or fuck this up for the Soviet Union to go down in the way that it did. I'd also say that Stalin, as a man who wrote about Marxism, made it accessible to the ordinary worker in a way that few others have done so, which is another reason why he must be demonized by the West. And also that his record as like an organizer of the party, all the way through his work in Georgia and the wider Southern Caucasus, through his reorganization of the Bolshevik Party in 1917, leading up to the revolution, his reorganization of it again after the death of Lenin, his ability to anticipate and lean into the mood of the masses was unrivaled amongst the Bolshevik Party. So, for instance, knowing when the right moment to carry out the campaign of, shall we say, rapid industrialization was, knowing when the right moment was to end the market reforms of the new economic policy, realizing that when a near civil war broke out in the Russian countryside between the kulaks and the landless peasants, that the time was to put the weight of the party and the state behind the landless peasants and take the land off the kulaks. All of that takes a hell of a lot of political skill to carry off. And I will conclude by comparing him with Trotsky, by saying that Trotsky gets credited by the Trotskyists as being, oh, well, he was demanding mass industrialization and the 5-year plans before Stalin did. Well, yes, because he called for it as early as 1925, when if they'd have tried to do it then, it wouldn't have worked. See, what Stalin was very good at is measuring where the mood of the masses was and what the masses were ready to do. Because you can't, as many other unsuccessful capitalist regimes have proved, you can't really force the masses into a direction of travel if there's mass resistance to it. Stalin understood that you had to win people over. You had to win the bulk of the working class over to the idea of the 5-year plans. You had to win the bulk of the landless and even the small landowning peasants over to the idea of collectivization. And he was able to put in place tactics and strategies to do that in a way that actually was tremendously successful. I hate to conclude on a cliche, but in truth, the imperialists just hate a winner. So there you go.
Yeah.
Um,
Now, I might just add really quickly, like that there is a it's quite a common trope that that Stalin was like this kind of stupid backwards peasant, and that's how Trotsky like referred to him. And like pretty much universally. Um, Stalin was actually very very, as Alex kind of eloquently laid out, was actually very very keen on not only like having a very clear foundational theoretical basis for communism, but ensuring that this reached like the wider masses as well, and that they were educated in it. And there are these two rather like charming anecdotes about him, which is I think they're included in Black Stalin. One of which is he would Stalin would carry around papers that contained Lenin's assorted speeches and writings, and in party discussions, which were like at the highest levels of the Communist Party, very lively, and Stalin welcomed and encouraged disagreement and debate. Frequently, Stalin would reach for these papers and say, "Well, let's see what Lenin had to say about this," on a particular subject, and also as well, he would routinely turn up unannounced at the homes of senior Communist Party officials to make sure that they were reading their theory. Like he would like go and scan their bookshelves to make sure that they were reading the books on them, and which I think is like quite sweet. And as people have said in the comments, like the fact that he did have a peasant working class background, that he rose to the position that he did, means that he has to be demonized. Like he wasn't from a
yes,
ruling caste, like actually like Trotsky was.
yes, indeed. Trotsky, by the way, was a Ukrainian landowner, so maybe that tells us quite a lot, or the son of a Ukrainian landowner. Um, right, moving on to the next question. This is from the same Substack subscriber. So Dial Danan Vanizdaya on Substack asks, is Zoran Mamdani another fake? Kit, what's your take?
Well, I think that he's certainly not a fake in the vein of AOC, who is quite clearly like a US intelligence operative and has been for much of her life, and has been groomed to occupy a fake radical position in order to capture public dissent. It strikes me that he's someone who did have, at least by US standards, quite radical positions, particularly on Palestine. And this has slowly but surely been battered out of him. I'm not expecting massively great things from him, particularly because most of the pre-existing government infrastructure, which includes senior officials within the kind of New York local government who are hardcore Zionists, and with repulsive political records, I don't really think that there's going to be very much in the way of change. And in the spirit of Obama, maybe he's been drafted in order to just at least give some respectable face to capitalist misery. Because I mean, I know people who live in New York, and they are like really struggling, and they are desperate for they might not phrase it in these terms, but they're desperate for socialism, or they're desperate for a redistributive economic model. Mamdani's already kind of rode back on a lot of statements that he made. It's not really clear whether he'll do anything particularly different. But by the same token, I mean, when the Anglo-American ruling elites are backed into a corner, such as after both world wars, they do occasionally give some degree of succor to the working class, if only to stave off revolution and to try and shut them up for a bit. So I mean, he might be okay as far as US politicians go, and might do some smidgen of good versus what came before him. But I think placing any faith in him at all is misguided. And as I say, already whatever radicalism he may have once have exhibited has been beaten out of him. I think he's only just become mayor. There's a lot more battering to come. So I mean, kind of in the spirit of The Wire, where like you have Carcetti come in, who does have like even if he's got baggage, he's got a vision for trying to clean up Baltimore, and then realizes there's actually very little he can do because of vested interests and bureaucracy and limited budgets, etc.
Well, I would follow on from that by saying that, look, if he's happy to have a photo with the son of George Soros, then that just tells you much of what you need to know about the guy. Look, there's always been an element in of socialism that is like what Marx and Engels referred to it as like bourgeois socialism, meaning that those who believe in an element of social reform, those who believe in elements of, should we say, alleviating the conditions of the masses. And there's always been a faction of the ruling class in every country that is interested in doing that, largely for reasons of self-preservation. And that's what Mamdani is. That's what the bulk of like the DSA is, either that or like, retrograde Trotskyites. And as Kit says, even if he absolutely meant 100% of everything that he said, the entire machinery of the New York governing structure is geared to serve the interests largely of the moneymakers in New York, who are Wall Street guys, real estate billionaires, and that's about it. It's not for nothing that the New York Police Department has a branch office in Israel. It goes to show exactly what kind of role New York City plays. It's a key city of the U.S. imperium. There's no way they're going to allow somebody who's actually going to threaten that to assume office there. Mamdani has already made his deals. He's clearly a chosen man of like the Soros wing of the U.S. ruling class. And he will largely do nothing. Like the free bus plan, good idea. I can see why people voted for it. It'd be a great thing to have. New York governor says it's not happening. It'll be vetoed. Now, the crucial test for a politician in any country, but particularly in like one of the core imperial cores, is when those above them in the political chain of command say, no, we're not going to do it. What do you do? Do you appeal to those who voted for you? You appeal to those who are excluded from the political process, who are the downtrodden, for want of a better term, and rally them to your cause? Do you put pressure on the power structure from the outside? Or do you eat shit and say, oh, no, sorry, we won't do that anymore, and then lean hard into something else to make up for the fact that you've given up on that? The state-run grocery stores, very good idea. I can see why people voted for it. It absolutely will not happen. And it absolutely will not happen because the commercial capitalists, the monopolists who own the big grocery interests in the United States, and bear in mind, the food companies in the United States and the food store all trace back to about 5 or 6 gigantic monopoly capitalists and who are backed by the biggest banks. There is no way that they are going to allow state-run competition selling things at cost price in New York City, because if that worked, then that would prove potentially fatal for their businesses across the entirety of the United States. That will not be allowed to take off. The American population must remain in a mode of perpetually getting fleeced by the entire capitalist class to the essentials of life. So again, Mamdani has already told us what he's going to do when all of this gets blocked, because he was asked specifically, and there's a reason why this question was asked in one of the debates, will you join protests when you are the mayor? And what that question is designed to provoke is the very answer that Mamdani gave the moderator, which is, well, I'll be in the mayor's office, so I'll be leading the charge from there. What that question is there for is for him to reassure the big guys on Wall Street that, no, I'm not going to encourage street protests against you. I'm not going to use the office of mayor and the huge platform that it gives me to mobilize people in the streets to put pressure on the Wall Street guys and the bureaucratic blockages in the New York governance system to try and get my agenda done. I'm going to say, oh, well, can't be done. Never mind. Here's 10 more trans flags we're going to hang on City Hall, because that's what he'll do, basically. It's what happens with all of these social reformers, when they don't get their reforms, they lean into something which the ruling class will accept. What will the American ruling class accept at the moment? Nothing except performative identity politics. So that's what you'll get from him in the end. He'll do one term, everyone will hate him by the end, and then he'll be replaced by some like massive reactionary. And that's what always happens. And this is what we were discussing, or part of what we were discussing in our conversation with David Miller, Professor David Miller. Go back and listen to that if you haven't done so already. And it's what we've discussed time and time again, which is when the ruling class in these imperial coronations says no, what's your move? And if your move is to cringe and say, sorry, I ever asked for it, then you're a waste of space, ultimately. Right. Did you want to add anything more there, Kit, or should we move to the next question?
Well, I think just to close this out, it must be better. This has been kind of forgotten, but you've got to bear in mind that, Barack Obama, he made a number of very radical pledges when he was on the campaign trail, including, stuff like, oh, I'll be on the picket lines when major employers go on strike. I'll be there with them. And then we see how that turned out. And that was at a time when capitalism was, was on the verge of total collapse. And he came in to save the day. And I think that, as you say, Alex, quite correctly, Mamdani's purpose is to come to the rescue, be a friendly face for a couple of years, leave office hated and reviled for not having done anything, and then clear the path for some terrible reactionary right-wing figure. And the same. This is the purpose of the Labour Party in the UK, and it's the purpose of Starmer, perhaps Burnham's government now. The next question is somewhat related to what we've been discussing, Alex.
Yes, this comes from Michael Wicks on Substack and reads as follows. I have a question that's not necessarily got anything to do with your latest stream on November the 13th with Gabriel Rockhill, coming up on the show, by the way, uncovering a lot of information on how much of the Frankfurt School and French radical leftists of the 60s were sponsored with CIA money because of their anti-communism. I was wondering if you had anything to say on that, and also your thoughts on British or American leftist figures who struck a particularly anti-communist line and their connections to British and American intelligence. Some who come to mind are Ralph Miliband, Eric Hobsbawm, Christopher Hill. So, Michael, thank you for the question. Kit, what's your take on this one?
Well, I mean, this is, as Alex mentioned, we have an exclusive interview with the mighty Gabriel Rockhill coming up on the start of December. So that's something for you guys to look out for. He is excellent and has a wonderful new book out on the penetration of the Western left by the CIA and other major intelligence agencies. That's put it in your diary. But in general, the notion that the named people, if not others, who were left, sort of ostensibly leftist, but virulently anti-communist, were they on the CIA or MI6's payroll? Almost without question, whether they knew it or not. Gabriel's book is effectively an update on Francis Stoner Saunders' book, Who Paid the Piper, which is about the cultural Cold War and how Western intelligence supported artists and poets and people in all sorts of fields to push an anti-communist line. They weren't always fully aware of it, but that's almost the wrong question to ask. There is a wider matrix, which is I think it's become more constrained over time. Spanning the media, mainstream culture, the arts, politics. In which certain views are either unsayable or must be maligned and libeled and smeared to the nth degree. And I think that the space for discussion and dissenting viewpoints has, yes, constricted massively, over time. But to give you an example, I think this is something we've discussed briefly before on Decline and Fall. A few years back, a supposedly organic and informal YouTube collective sprouted called BreadTube, and this comprised a large number of YouTube content creators who had very slickly produced videos, and they got an enormous amount of media attention, and featured, heavily on in the Guardian, the New York Times, and they were its members were interviewed by Owen Jones, another totally not MI6 officer, they were presented as radical leftists, and a lot of people who were on the left and identified as communists bought into this. It was a very effective psyop, and what they were actually doing was they were pushing lockstep support of the state, and at best kind of socially liberal centrism, as somehow really, really, really radical. It was very heavy on identity politics, and it was very what's the word? It sought to frame quote unquote far left viewpoints as somehow extremist and potentially that people possessed of such views could turn to violence, and they were very aggressive in denouncing political violence as a tool, and very big on, and the media ran with this narrative that BreadTube is great for de-radicalizing people, etc. Now, in late 2021 at the Grey Zone, we received leaked documents that showed that a very prominent BreadTuber called Abigail Thorne, who runs a very popular channel called Philosophy Tube, which talks a lot about every kind of philosophy, including political, was making pro-vaccine, pro-lockdown, pro-state propaganda in secret on the British government's dime. And they were working in direct coordination with this very shadowy firm called Valent Project, which is run by a veteran British intelligence adjacent psychological warfare specialist. And we got pretty viciously attacked at the time, even though it's all there in black and white in leaked documents that Philosophy Tube was taking money and direction from the British state about what to say to her absolutely vast audience. On YouTube, she gets hundreds of thousands of views sometimes. The point is these people over the course of the Gaza genocide have all exposed themselves heavily and destroyed any credibility they have, because they initially tried to ignore the issue entirely because it was too problematic for them as state agents to talk about with any seriousness. And then finally, at last, they started making the mildest possible statements that you could imagine about the 21st century Holocaust in Gaza, and it wasn't Destiny. There was another BreadTuber who, ContraPoints. This is a very prominent member of BreadTube who's since, I think, deleted her Twitter and has kind of vanished from all mainstream consideration. She has 2 million followers on YouTube. She put out a statement about Gaza, basically saying, well, I'm not sure. People have asked me to, express solidarity with the Palestinians, and I'm not sure that would be helpful. And she got absolutely. It was honestly, it was like ran to like several pages of just like sophistry for why I'm a coward and why I'm not going to condemn this in the strongest possible terms, and while trying to like both sides it, and we express sympathy with Israelis who've been affected by this as well, and it was just like it was absolutely morally repugnant. and yeah, and it led to her deleting her Twitter. I'm not sure if it's been reinstated, but it was absolutely devastating to the wider group's credibility. And I think they themselves did themselves more damage than Max Blumenthal and I did reporting on leaks, which is a kind of bitterly ironic, I guess. But like, if someone occupies a space in the mainstream and they're ostensibly on the left, they are in 99% of cases a snake, an operative, because they wouldn't be allowed any breathing room if they actually had radical views, and there was any risk of that reaching a big audience.
Yes, particularly now. I mean, just to answer the point, the question brought up by Michael on the likes of Ralph Miliband, Hobsbawm, Hill, etc. All of the anti-Soviet characters that floated around in the 50s, 60s, 70s, especially those who either came out of Trotskyite parties, which is like Miliband was associated with the Socialist Register, which is a Trotskyite journal in this country, and was linked to several Trotskyite organizations in Canada as well. Hobsbawm and Hill were Communist Party people who then left over, funnily enough, the secret speech of Khrushchev being the biggest motivator, that and the intervention against the fascist rising in Hungary, which they all sort of decided was a terrible thing and would cause them all to become social democrats. Now, Hobsbawm and Hill and Miliband, arguably, all wrote things that at various different points I've found useful, like Hill's History of the English, Making of the English Working Class, Hobsbawm's trilogy of books on like the taking us from the late 18th to the early 20th century, Age of Revolution, Age of Capital, Age of Empire. Those are all great. His later one, Age of Extremes, is not so great. Very much something for the sort of boomer ex-leftists who sort of retired to a comfortable, complacent existence, doubting any revolution could ever succeed and making money from doing so. They all, though, became these sort of anti-communist figures in later life. Like Hobsbawm became a devotee of Neil fucking Kinnock. Hill, not quite as bad, but took up the sort of bland sort of reformism and horror at the awful dictatorship of the proletariat and the crimes of Stalin. So this is why these people were promoted. It's not to say that there's not useful things you can get from reading them. You can. They at least nominally remain Marxists for quite some time afterwards. But as Kit says, like, even if you don't know that you're being promoted, if you're getting money from an academic institution, a decision has been made that your work is at least non-threatening or even useful to those who are in charge. Because here, to go back to the Stalin question, who are the two leaders whose books you never see in British bookshops? You see Lenin sometimes, very rarely, but you do see Lenin sometimes. You never see Stalin and you never see Mao, ever. There's never, ever see anything of theirs. You don't even see, you might see of Mao's guerrilla warfare in a specialist bookshop with a very long introduction by a US Marine Corps general telling you to ignore all the political content. But you never see Stalin. Now, you'll see all of these people. And again, this isn't a coincidence. What gets sold, what gets promoted, what gets pushed to people, and like with BreadTube, what the algorithm pushes you towards. These are all clearly worked out. These aren't accidents. This isn't, the invisible hand of the market in play. This is a conscious decision over what to promote and what not to promote. And most people who get the grants from the academic award bodies, who get the publishing deals from the Penguin and Random House and the other Bloomsbury and the other big publishing houses, most of them won't ask too many questions about why they've been chosen. They'll just take the money. But they've been chosen for specific reasons, which is that book's been looked at and it's been judged to be safe. Because there is a censorship regime. We've covered it before. Kit, you've written about it. Especially there's a censorship regime in Britain. There's a less formal one, but still very much present censorship regime in the United States. And if you are promoted, then yes, you've been chosen because you're safe. I mean, we call it, those of us who are Marxist-Leninists call what we believe in, what we practice, scientific socialism, because we believe that you can scientifically analyze any particular problem. And our opponents do the same thing. The people who run the censorship regime, some of them, I mean, not all of them, I mean, the servants of MI6 are not usually a clever bunch, but some of the people in MI6 and MI5 do know what they're doing. And they analyze things scientifically as well. And they know very well that a certain kind of analysis is likely to lead people into a direction where they start questioning the system to the point where they start to believe that the system shouldn't exist anymore. And that is unacceptable. What is acceptable are partial critiques of the system or partial critiques of historical events. Those are acceptable. And you can say that, oh, well, aren't we free and democratic? We've allowed this Marxist critique to go out. So they know what they're doing and they know what they're promoting, and nothing is done by accident. And that doesn't mean you can't find value in the aforementioned academics' works. But one must always bear in mind that, again, these people are promoted to you for a reason. And it's like, I'll give you another example of like an intellectual trend that was useful for a particular imperialist endeavor. Remember New Atheism? Remember that laugh? Remember Christopher Hitchens? Remember, Richard Dawkins and the various others who became like the doyens of this particular movement? Why was that promoted? Was it to target Christians in the West? No. Was it to say that all those who believe in that God is Allah and Muhammad is his prophet are all, subhuman animals to be civilized at gunpoint via the Iraq War? Well, that's your answer, basically. So, yes. Do we want to handle another one?
Oh yeah, I mean, I was just going to say very quickly. Like, I wanted to mention Christopher Hitchens and the wider New Atheist movement as like a perfect example of this. Like, of all of these Trotskyists, predominantly, very interestingly, who were but what they were pushing was straight up imperialism, i.e., religious people, particularly Muslims, are very backwards and stupid. And that we in the enlightened West are on this you have this duty and to civilize these savages. Interestingly, this was New Atheism was huge throughout the War on Terror. Second War on Terror ended, boom, all of these people vanish. Their books stopped being published. They stopped being on TV because they stopped being of use to power. Now, I think this leads very neatly into our last question, and which covers some of the ground that we've previously gone over in this show. Morgan on Substack says, "Hi both, just got into your show lately and really enjoying it, so thanks very much." No, thank you, Morgan. And also had a request for a book suggestion. I'm after something good on life in the Soviet Union, perhaps something highlighting the positives, achievements, and policies that worked. Which is a very good question because, as Alex says, every source of information imaginable, including internet search engines, is geared towards pushing you towards books which are complete dog shit about the Soviet Union. And if I guarantee you, if you do a Google search now for like best books on the Soviet Union, it will be lists of works which are invariably like the Gulag Archipelago and how awful and terrible and repressive and evil life was under communism. So, I mean, in that vein, an interesting recommendation I will shoot from the off, and I think it's particularly worthy of consideration because it's not written by someone who could plausibly be accused of being left-wing and certainly wouldn't characterize themselves as such. It's Beyond the Wall by Katja Hoyer, which is about life in East Germany. And it got, very interestingly, it was very well reviewed in the mainstream, everywhere apart from Germany itself, where there was like mass political and media uproar that she had written a sentimental and sympathetic treatment of life in the former GDR and perhaps future GDR, because after the reunification of Germany, which was very much a hostile takeover in which the West took over the East, destroyed all its industry, impoverished the local population, and effectively subjugate and destroyed every element of the political and social and economic systems that many residents of that country held dear. It's been unsayable that actually things were pretty good, like for people living in East Germany. They weren't perfect, but people wanted for nothing. There was no homelessness, there was no unemployment, there was no hunger. The citizens enjoyed a broad array of protections and rights and guarantees that they do not today. And we see the legacy of that with East Germany now, very high levels of unemployment, very low wages, very little in the way of employment opportunities, and any and all kind of yearning to regain what was lost is derisively dismissed as nostalgia. So that's one mainstream work which is I found it quite readable and very interesting, particularly given that it's not written by someone who you would expect to have a positive view of the GDR.
So certainly a very interesting one. I'd add onto that, specifically about the Soviet Union, two works by an American author called Albert Szymanski, who was writing in the late 70s and early 80s, which is interesting because he's writing at a time when we're told that the Soviet Union was this basket case that needed to be reformed. And he paints quite a different, though not entirely uncritical picture. The two books that I would recommend, because they're very easy to read and it'll give you an awful lot about the Soviet Union quite quickly, are Is the Red Flag Flying?, which is an analysis of the political economy of the Soviet Union. So like how things worked and what they did, etc. Very interesting details about how the Soviet system was working. This is like 1977, 78, 79. So very late Brezhnev era, which again is an era we're told was this in the West and by the Gorbachevites, but is looked back on by many people who lived in the former Soviet Union at the time as a period of unprecedented growth. And now, if you've seen me do other programs on this, you'll have many critical things to say about the Brezhnev era, but very interesting that there's these two books by an American author, or a Polish American author, no less, wouldn't expect that these days, talking about the positives of them. So Is the Red Flag Flying is the first one. The other one is Human Rights in the Soviet Union, which addresses specifically the complaints of the human rights industry in the West, and tackles like the claims of the dissidents and makes the comparison with the United States. Those two are very good because that will give you a positive analysis of the Soviet period in the period when we're told is the least positive, which is the towards the end of the Brezhnev era. So those two I would certainly recommend. Those are great for starting off with, and then also go and read the Lazardo book about the Stalin period. And also, I would read a book about the counter-revolutions, which sheds some light on this as well. This is called The Velvet Counter-Revolution by the Belgian communist Ludo Martens. And I'll also read his other book entitled Another View of Stalin. So we'll put all those book recommendations that we've made there in the show notes so that you can take those away and build up your Decline and Fall library. But
may I just add a couple more, if possible, Alex?
Go for it.
Yeah, sure. So I think on the subject of like Soviet economic and social development, like Farm to Factory by Robert Allen is quite an interesting work, and it delves into significant detail how the Russian Revolution and the Soviet Union that followed was from the perspective of development in every regarding an absolutely extraordinary experiment, which had a revolutionary impact not only within the Soviet Union itself, but also outside it. I think that's a very interesting work. Again, not written by someone who could be accused of having, kind of particularly radical credentials. Another mainstream work that's quite that's very accessible and also I think does have some valuable lessons in it is Peter Dolack's "It's Not Over." And it's about learning lessons from the socialist experiment and what went right, what went wrong, the differences in how different countries within the Warsaw Pact, but also different socialist systems operated, and what we can learn from them. So I think that those are worthy of consideration.
Excellent stuff. So we hope we've given you enough reading materials to last you until Christmas there. We expect book reports from all of you. But be sure to tune in very soon for, I believe that's, I think this 5th, I think it is, for the conversation with Gabriel Rockhill. That's coming up to be advertised. So we'll be covering a lot of this stuff then. Thank you to everybody who's tuned in today for this Q&A. We'll be doing this on a monthly basis. So if you haven't had your question addressed today, drop it into the chat or message system on Substack to make sure we get it, or email it to us or message one of us, and it'll be accumulated and get ready for this time next month, which may well be a Christmas special, getting on towards that time of year when Stalin comes and kicks in your front door and takes you away to the gulag if you've been naughty, or delivers you a copy of the Communist Manifesto if you've been nice. Your choice as to how you behave. But thank you to everybody who's tuned in today, and we hope you have found edification through this process of Socratic dialogue. And good evening from me in frozen Glasgow.
And a good evening from me in the once and future Yugoslavia. Take care, guys. Thanks for joining. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.